Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Coon, members of the Hall of Fame, ladies and gentlemen, and I should say baseball fans, because without you baseball fans, none of us would be here today. Years ago, writers were telling me that I'd make the Hall of Fame, so I kind of prepared a speech. But somewhere along in the 28 years, he got lost.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's do this, everybody. How are you? It's Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. I appreciate it. And sorry to have missed you last week, but as you can probably tell by my voice, I'm still getting over a battle with the flu. Yes, not the one apparently that the vaccine was for this season, but yet another strain. So, yes, it knocked me out, and hopefully you won't get it, and it will be just smooth sailing from here on out. So, but be careful out there, friends. That's all I can tell you. I welcome you back to the proceedings. It's nice to be part of your lives again in 2025. And we're talking about some baseball again this time around. We are joined by our guest this week, Jerry Grillo, who has an excellent biography of our topic this week. His name is Johnny Mize, and he's known as the Big Cat. And yes, he certainly qualifies for our little genre here. Played for the New York version of the Giants back in the day. 1942, took a little break, quote unquote, for the war years. We'll talk about that coming up in our conversation with Jerry, and then came back to the New York Giants, and then went to the crosstown rival New York Yankees of all teams. And prior to all of that, he started his career with the St. Louis Cardinals. He a member of the National Baseball Hall of Fame. And as that little setup give you sort of an indication there, a humble guy, this guy was, Johnny Mize, with a chip on his shoulder for good reason, because this is a fellow who was, I would argue, quite underrated when it came to being understood as a Hall of Famer. This is a guy who, as a first baseman for the Cardinals and the Giants, and then later on the New York Yankees, at 5 consecutive world championships with those New York Yankees, his last 5 years of baseball career from 49 to 53. He led the National League in home runs for 4 times, often battling a young buck, literally and figuratively, by the name of Ralph Kiner for many of those years. He hit 3 home runs in a single game 6 different times. He won 3 RBI crowns and a batting championship in the National League. He finished his career with 359 home runs and a .312 batting average. Yet, after leaving the game in 1953, it took the Veterans Committee in 1981 to vote him into the Hall of Fame. By the way, with two other Giants that year, not Giants of the game per se, Rube Foster, Negro League pioneer, and Bob Gibson. So that was a heck of a year of induction on August the 2nd, 1981, from which that clip came from. And a humble guy in many respects, not on the field as much as he was off the field. I think he was quite down-home, small country bumpkin kind of guy. Born and raised in Little Demarest, Georgia, in the northeastern corner of the state. And he died in 1993 at age 80 in Demarest as well. So it's a guy who not only knew where he came from, but went back afterwards. But what a career, and some interesting wrinkles to all of that stuff. And we're going to get into that with our guest Jerry Grillo in just a second. The book, which we'll refer to early and often here, is called Big Cat: The Life of Baseball Hall of Famer Johnny Mize. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. Of course, it's available wherever you can get good books. And if you would like to do us a favor, by all means, go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this little here episode. I think it's numbered, what the heck is it? Number 3. How many of these have we done now? This is 379. My goodness, 379. And you'll find a couple of convenient links to said book available in hardcover and Kindle versions. And I think also it's an audio book as well with a trial of the Audible service there at Amazon. By doing so, of course, we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love that helps keep our lights on, he says. And we appreciate that to no end. So lots of cool stuff coming up in this conversation. We try to kind of limit our biographical treatments here, but Mize had a really interesting career. I think kind of solid and somewhat quiet, so to speak. But this guy was the bomb, and also too. And we've talked about this a little bit. I think it's also interesting to understand that the 3 years that he left the game to join the war effort during World War II is indicative of what was going on at that time. And as you'll hear in our conversation with Jerry, part of an amazing array of baseball talent while in the military service. We'll talk about his time where he played with the Great Lakes Naval Station baseball team, which is just a stone's throw from where we're recording this episode in Northern Illinois. He played with people like Phil Rizzuto and Dom DiMaggio and Sam Chapman and Pee Wee Reese and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to get into that kind of part of it too. Just because he was part of the war effort doesn't mean that he was not still playing the game. A 10-time All-Star he was, a 5-time World Series champion. Let's talk about the Big Cat, the story of Johnny Mize. Here's our conversation we had with Jerry Grillo just a couple of days ago. And as always, please enjoy. This show is, I'm not sure what it is, but it's evolved over time. And, ostensibly we began as sort of a curio around teams and leagues and various ephemera that have sort of come and gone in the realm of largely professional sports.
Right.
And
right.
In the beginning, kind of, sort of like, the comical and the quizzical and the, like, what the hell was that all about? And it in some cases got a little personal and a little, the memories started to flow in as more people we talk to and stuff. And we also try to kind of nibble around the edges. And you've done a masterful job of trying to help me nibble around the edges here to sort of give you the entree. Clearly, Big Cat was a guy who played in a couple of teams and scenarios that aren't around anymore. So we'll give you the benefit of the doubt there. But before we get into it, how about a little background about you and how you came into this story? Like what was the whole motivation behind it? Well, how did you come to it?
Sure. Well, it's funny. It's one of those things that goes back to some of the earliest memories. I've always been kind of a baseball nerd, if you will. Like I enjoyed playing the game, but realized early on that I was never going to be like, a center fielder for pay. And so, I got into the history of the game. And really from an early age, I would listen to stories that like my father and my uncles and, his friends would talk about these guys from, that old time, the late 40s and early 50s when, you had guys like DiMaggio and then Mantle and Mays, Campanella, Robinson. And then there was this guy named Mize who was this role player with the Yankees that my dad really had an affinity for. He liked he was kind of like the hired gunslinger, and my dad was a Yankees fan. God love him. God bless his soul. And but he loved Mize, and we saw him at an old timers game years ago. Mize was old and fat and stretching his polyester St. Louis Cardinals uniform. And I just sort of became interested in him. It's not like I studied him. Long story short, I moved to where I now live in Northeast Georgia, which is the home I'm in now is about 15 miles where Johnny Mize was born, lived and died. And I was the local newspaper editor for a short time before moving on to other things and got to meet Johnny's daughter. And she pitched a story about her old man who had since passed away. And I was blown away. Wow, the big cat was from right here. I think somewhere in my memory I knew he was from Northeast Georgia, but anyway, that kind of brought it all together, and that was 20 something years ago, man, when I thought I'd do this book. And for a lot of reasons that if you want to get into, we can, personal family kind of reasons, I had to put the project down. I actually had a publisher interested in the book 20 something years ago, but had to put it down for about 20 years. And a couple of years ago, got started. I thought I'd always get back to it again. I'd done too much research, met too many players, guys who are now dead, and I thought I really need to finish this. And so that's really kind of how it came to be. It was personal interest in baseball, and then sort of a personal happenstance that I happened to be right near where Johnny Mize lived and died.
All right, so let's talk about that confluence there, because I got to think that if your father was a Yankees fan and maybe some of I'm guessing you grew up in the New York metro area, or perhaps had a period of time there to see him play, or maybe this was not. Maybe this is a Cardinals old timers thing.
You know what? It's funny. It was actually an Atlanta Braves old timers thing. So
okay, even more interesting. Go ahead.
Right, you can tell from my thick Atlanta accent that. But I've been in the Atlanta area for embarrassed to say, 50 years, right? So this has been home, really. I'm from New York, but a few trips back to live in New York have, kept my accent almost there. So yeah, Dad grew up in the city and was a Yankees fan, and my uncles were Giants and Dodgers fan. They were all over the place. So I grew up with that kind of education, hearing about the Willie, Mickey, and the Duke argument, essentially. And yeah, so that was kind of their era. And I grew up hearing these tales, and like any other kid who was into baseball, it kind of sounded like mythology. These were these Olympian heroes, and so I always kind of maintained that interest, even while I was writing stories. For a while, I was a sports writer, news writer, business writer for many years, editor. So, but that interest always stayed there. And yeah, so yeah, he was playing in Atlanta at an old timers game, and Dad took us to see Johnny Mize and Stan Musial and a whole bunch of other superstars.
Well, it's also interesting too, because as we'll get into in a little while, I mean, Mize was kind of one of those rare players in the New York baseball firmament, right? During his time in the 1940s and the early 1950s, he was actually a guy who, if you will, played both sides of the fence, so to speak, right? I mean, obviously 3 teams amongst the Dodgers, the Giants, and the Yankees during that time, but having played for the Giants just before and then just after his war years, and then becoming a Yankee, right? So there's obviously a lot of I don't know, I would call it sort of a New York metro angst, I guess, perhaps, depending on when you sort of, when your dad or others were Mize fans, so to speak, because of that, I don't know, lack of allegiance or trading offenses, so to speak.
That's a great point, and I know that but I'm not just buying time with that either. Because I say that because nobody's ever brought that up before, and it makes me think of my Uncle Frank, who I won't get in but my Uncle Frank was a Giants fan. He used to go see them in the Polo Grounds, and I remember him being one of those guys, if my memory is correct on this, and I think it is, that would sort of pardon the expression, bitch at my father about how the Yankees got Mize away from the Giants, because Dad being the Yankees fan. And Dad always took great pleasure in that, because Mize came over and Dad, like my dad didn't hate the Yankees or the Dodgers like a lot of, there's a lot of, you use the word angst, which is great. There's a lot of angst in those rivalries. And my dad was one of those rare, open-minded kind of guys who just loved the game. He appreciated the Dodgers and the Giants, but he loved the Yankees because I think when he was really young, I'm showing his age and my age. The first player he remembered seeing was Lou Gehrig. So this would have been 1938, 39. So my dad was a very young kid, and he loved the Yankees ever since then. So pride of the Yankees. And so yeah, there was an interesting sort of little drama among the old men over, yeah, Mize left the Giants and went to the Yankees. And whereas Mize, this is interesting. When he was sent to the Yankees, at first he was stunned because he thought he'd finish his career in the Polo Grounds. But then he thought about it for about 5 minutes and, realizing that the Yankees are almost always in the pennant race, he said nobody ever really got broke joining the Yankees. And so he was kind of happy to join the Yankees.
Well, and led him to a bunch of World Series titles in the process. But I digress for just a few moments, right? So, all right, so let's back up. Let's go to northeastern Georgia. I believe the town is pronounced as a Demorest.
It's a Demarest.
Demarest. Yes. Okay. I grew up in northern New Jersey, right? So there is a Demarest in Bergen County, but it's not spelled this way. So I was obviously thinking perhaps, but not. All right. So tell me then how your Atlanta life, if you will, and the northeastern burb of Demarest, Georgia, sort of helped perhaps accelerate this understanding of this guy, but then maybe sort of catalyzing it into an actual project, albeit 25 years in the making.
That goes back to this idea of living in a place, right? And really living in a place, which is kind of weird, but I've lived now here in, this part of the world for about 25, 26, 7 years, longest part of my life to live in one place. So I've gotten to know a little bit about the culture and, the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And try to hold on to the good. Mize being one of the good things, right? And what's interesting is, for me, is this concept of cussed independence, right? And it's a phrase I use once in the book, not that anybody would or should ever remember it, but cussed independence is sort of defines the mindset of a lot of these Appalachian people, in this area, a lot of my neighbors, this kind of thing. This sense of, when you think about the South and the Deep South, for example, it wasn't a guarantee that a lot of the people in say this part of the world were joining the Confederacy, right? Their attitude was like, I don't own slaves, and I take care of me and mine. And see, Mize, as I came to understand him long after he died, embodied a lot of that. He had this sort of rugged, independent streak, and which worked against him in some ways. Baseball, it's been called a fraternity, and I think to some degree fairly so. I'm not enough of an insider to say it is or it isn't, but seems like it is. And Mize was this rugged sort of individualist from Northeast Georgia. I think proud of his roots, but equally proud of the fact that he was this. In some ways, a cultured man of the world, right? He forced himself to get outside of these these green hills, and he saw a good chunk of the world. Exposed himself to a wide variety of people, right? And I think it opened his mind, and I think he always had that sense of, I can make up my own mind, right? This was his attitude. So anyway, it sounds, I hope I'm not off base there, but a lot of this is local sort of attitude. And that got me interested. The more I learned about him, the more I thought, this is a guy I'd like to write about. I wish I knew him. He's hard to get to know, man. Partly because he did play it so close to the vest. Even his kids, there's a lot they didn't know about him. I'll brag quickly and say that they learned, or at least his son, because Johnny's daughter, Judy, has died. But his only son, his stepson, Jim, learned way more from this book than he did from his dad. So it was an interesting exercise in getting to know the guy. But while getting to know him, you mentioned the 25, getting to know this area that I live in, the area that kind of, birthed him, that kind of thing. I think it helped. I hope it comes across in the book a little bit about, this idea of him being this, I don't want to say the laconic Southerner, but sort of this, this rugged, independent Northeast Georgia mountain kind of guy. And I hope some of the book reflects that. Yeah, I didn't want to cartoon the guy, but also that's kind of who he was.
So why was he so hard to sort of figure out, and perhaps why did he keep stuff so close to the vest? Maybe a little bit of the personality of this guy. I mean, I'm going to guess in some respects that there's some of this is, this is also a guy who was, he played in the midst of, and then took time off, if you will, for the war effort, right? And there is sort of that greatest generation label that, that a Tom Brokaw would have kind of thrown in there, where there is certainly a type of American male, if you will, that where the war experiences and serving one's country, the duty of that, and it's a harkens back to a time when there was a lot more self-sacrifice and maybe arguably you didn't really kind of talk about that kind of stuff. And I don't know if that maybe was a part of this story or maybe it's just an addition to perhaps what his personality was even going into the major leagues before going to the war.
Well, I do think his taciturn nature was in some ways due to his generation. Yes, I think that's a fair assessment, but also due to his region, this part of the country where people are not often going to strike up a conversation with you until they get to know you a little bit. There's a mistrust sometimes. It's interesting.
A guardedness, maybe.
Yeah, a guardedness, more of a guardedness than anything else. And I think that also now this is my own observation from again living in this area for a long time and in the South, for even longer. This idea of the Southern accent, oftentimes was looked upon as well, that guy's a rube or whatever. And when Mize was in his prime as a youngster, playing for the Cardinals in the 30s, he wasn't the most talkative guy. He was a deep thinker. He thought a lot about his job. He thought a lot about his bats. He was a scientist when it came to his bats and the tools of his trade and how he approached it. But he was not the guy that was going to go out and join the Friars Club and do whatever, and he wasn't going to make speeches, and he would talk baseball. And the few guys that I was fortunate to meet who actually knew him or were his teammates were the ones who sort of allowed that fact for me. If you got him talking about baseball or hitting, you couldn't shut him up. He loved talking about that stuff. But nobody, the one thing that never came up is, he was a dimwit, he was a rube or he was stupid. He was always, from the people I spoke with who met him, he was kind of a sharp guy, and he'd look at you. He had those, he had those kind of slit low eyes, that looked like they were kind of sizing you up. Whether how much that is physiological and how much of that was him sizing you up, is for somebody to guess. But from talking with a few people like Donald Honig, the writer, he was that kind of guy. He'd size you up. He'd look at you. He wouldn't necessarily laugh at your jokes, but he might say something funny. He might say something that's sardonic. So he was that kind of guy.
All right, so tell me how he gets into baseball. He kind of comes up with the Cardinals, which I would argue is maybe the first sort of third, if you will, of his pro career. And by the way, this is a guy who not only is a member of the Hall of Fame, but was a consistent all-star. I mean, his first all-star appearance was with the Cardinals in his second season, I think, in 37. He was also an all-star in his last season with the New York Yankees in 1953. So this guy was consistent from the get-go. How does he get there? How does he become a standout player? And it looks like in the beginning in his Cardinals career, it was kind of shaky to begin with.
With the Cardinals back then in the 30s, of course, it was known as Branch Rickey's chain gang. Rickey was the genius who, and I mean that sincerely, there's very few, I think, people you could say, well, that guy was a genius in baseball, but he was one of them, right? I mean, he invented the minor leagues, among other things. We know what else he did and some of the chances he took, and we also know about his business acumen. And he invented the minor leagues for the Cardinals. And Johnny got caught up in that as a 17-year-old, and he spends 6 years in the minor leagues as this ferocious hitter and all-around player. Frankly, in the minor leagues, there are stories about what a great arm he had, something you didn't read about a lot later on when he was injured and he was a major leaguer. But all this to say, he worked his way sort of sideways through the Cardinals chain for a few years, finally ascended to the team after struggling through some serious injuries that, frankly, because of the way baseball was in those days, they would allow a player to take a chance on what could be a, catastrophic injury, right? And so that Mize did that essentially and was lucky in that he didn't injure himself permanently, and he was able to get an operation that saved his career. Actually, months before he broke in as a rookie with the Cardinals in 1936. So
Didn't even quit before, so to speak,
he actually retired temporarily from the game the year before he became a rookie with the Cardinals while toiling with the Rochester Red Wings, one of the Cardinals AAA teams. He essentially retired. He asked for his release because the doctor for the Cardinals, who was by all accounts, a sort of a legend, Robert Hyland had suggested he might retire, and so he did, but he didn't like the idea. And the story that I found, and I wish I could clarify more of this, but it came from the legendary Ralph McGill, columnist for the Atlanta Journal, Pulitzer Prize winner for his, for the work that he did during integration. But he was a sports columnist at the time. And he wrote a pretty interesting story about Mize getting a second opinion in Atlanta from an unnamed physician. And the guy suggested that it might be, a specific injury, and so the doctor in St. Louis weighed in and essentially said, "I think I could fix that." And so he performed this touch and go surgery, and this had to be like 3 or 4, maybe 5 months before the Cardinals broke spring training in 36. So he got the surgery, and the Cardinals were like, "Okay, this is basically it. He either makes the team or." They were probably going to get rid of him, like they had tried to do in the past, because he was very popular as a minor leaguer. Other teams heard about this behemoth, this great hitter, and they tried to get Johnny before he came to the Cardinals. It never stuck. He played with the Reds for one spring training. He actually played spring training with the major leaguers, and performed admirably. Hit 400, hit some tape measure home runs, but again, ultimately was considered too injured, and the Reds didn't take a chance. They sent him back to the Cardinals. And long story short, he winds up breaking in with the Cardinals in 36, and he's a hit. Bad pun. Immediately, he's a hit. His first 6 hits as a major leaguer are extra base hits. He's hitting doubles and triples and home runs. He begins as a pinch hitter and then works his way into the starting lineup and replaces an all-star level player named Ripper Collins, who was a terrific player who actually had kept Johnny in the minor leagues because of his excellent play with the Gas House Gang Cardinals in the early 30s. So Johnny displaces him. They trade Ripper away eventually, and Johnny becomes the first string first baseman. And and he actually has an all-star year as a rookie, but because he's a rookie, he doesn't make the team. Finishes high in a lot of the major hitting categories, something he proceeds to do over the next 6 years with the Cardinals.
Yeah, there's a great quote of his, right, about his, if you will, lack of playing time in the minors.
Yeah, I'm going to have a hard time recalling it, but
he's quoted as saying, I don't know what the source of it is. There's some kind of Cardinals yearbook of some sort. "I'm the only guy who played in the minor leagues because I couldn't play." Excuse me. Let me start that again. "I'm the only guy who played in the major leagues because I couldn't play in the minors."
That's exactly right.
Which I think is great. It's a very, but it obviously he's got an abundant amount of talent, and he's hitting the ground running. And then some. And talk about his contributions early on with the Cardinals, because again, this is like a third of his career per se. I mean, he was already like in the most valuable player conversation early in his career.
He really was. He actually, I was having a conversation with another writer recently he's working on a project, and he's done some things. This fellow what did he say? He said that regarding Mize, that one of the interesting things about him was how he broke in so quick, he broke in so well with the Cardinals, and for a lot of years, people always associated him with the Cardinals, right? And I think that's because the war years broke up his Giants career and so on and so forth. But without getting too far afield, he becomes a superstar with the Cardinals and probably should have won the MVP 1 or 2 years. That this was in a time, of course, when they often gave it to the pennant winning team, a guy who's on the pennant winning team. And if you look at some of the metrics that we have today, it's easy to say, oh, easily, clearly, Johnny Mize was the best player in the league, this year and this year. But all that to say, he was in the running, he was in the conversation, he was well thought of. And he was always among the leaders in all the categories. He led the league in homers while he was with the Cardinals, in triples, in doubles, in batting average. All the things that we measure today, even WAR, on base percentage, this kind of thing. He even set a record as a rookie for the most intentional walks received. And now it's since been smashed to bits, but at the time, it was the record. He set the record with 20 something intentional walks. And this was as a rookie. And I think part of it was because pitchers saw this guy was hitting the hell out of the ball, but also that they didn't figure him out yet. Nobody really knew too much about him yet. I mean, there were some theories because he had spent a few months with the Reds, but at any rate, yeah, he was that kind of guy early on. And but he also was a guy who knew his worth, and he didn't have a problem holding out for more money at the end of each season.
All right, well, let's talk about his worth, because this is a guy, again, who was in sort of nibbling at some most valuable player things. He had his home run record in 1940 was basically the Cardinals team record for until what, 1990 or so, right, or 2000.
Mhm.
But he Branch Rickey, to talk about Ricky's kind of approach to talent and maybe the dynamic between the two of them, because I got to think that that Mize was, not only understanding of his worth, but perhaps maybe, I don't know, did he rub Ricky and management the wrong way, or was Ricky just smart enough to recognize that this guy's valuable at this age and this period of his career, that maybe we can get something for him?
Yeah, I think it's all of those mercenary things together. It really is, and it was quite an education for the young big cat, if you will, in terms of, hell, this is a business, but yeah, Ricky was a great manipulator. Right. As you mentioned, at the time, he knew the timing. Okay, Mize is 23 as a rookie, which, some people would say is old. He could have broken in at 2020. He was ready at 2021. But all that to say, Ricky knew his value and had an idea of how many years he'd be valuable given his injury, history, given his size, all of this stuff. I think Ricky was brilliant in sizing this stuff up and also, in playing that game with the press, because like Mize, I think held out after his first year, like even after a rookie and his rookie season. And Ricky would say things in the press like, this young man isn't all that he's making himself out to be, that kind of thing. He'll soon learn better. And we've got this other young guy who is, nobody worth a
But
damn.
he was putting up the numbers, though, right? So it's not coming from a place of
Right.
being right. So he had something to rest his, to
Right,
leverage, right?
but say after that first year, Ricky's main argument would generally be, well, he's just a rookie. Let's see him prove himself, in the cauldron of a full season. Because, if you go back, you look, Mize probably was 5/6 of a full, you know what I mean? He had maybe had 490 plate appearances, right, before as he worked his way into the lineup. So right, Ricky probably works that against him, and he only hit 19 home runs, that kind of thing. And the next year, so Ricky was great at also saying things like, well, sure, you hit more home runs, but your batting average went down, right? I mean, that kind of thing. And so Mize would come, he would come with game. He'd say, but I had these numbers, and I think my research being what it was, which I thought I did a pretty good job. I dove pretty deep. I could find that, Mize usually got a little bit more than what he was asking for. Like it wasn't like, Ricky wouldn't say, oh, you're getting 6,000 and that's it. I think Ricky was also smart enough to know that if the kid was holding out for 9,000, that if he came back with 7,500, eventually he'd sign. And that's usually what happened. Mize didn't, I don't think he ever missed any regular season playing time as a result of a holdout.
Well, let's put this in perspective, though, right? So he played for the Cardinals from 36 to 41. He was an all-star 37 and 39 and 40 and 41. He was the National League batting champion in 39. He was a two-time, at the time, National League home run leader in 39 and 40. He led the league in ribbies in 1940, at least the first time. Later in his career he did as well. It's pretty clear this guy's a star. And the Branch Rickey sort of thing, right? I mean, it's this sort of dynamic between having a star and building your team and keeping your team sort of solid around this guy who's obviously very, very valuable versus, I don't know, an irritant, too expensive, maybe not a team player in his mind, or frankly, just valuable.
Yeah, I think
for bait for the to get more players and all that kind of stuff, and to take his value and put it in the market.
Irritant is a big word. I think he was an irritant. He was something of a clubhouse lawyer, right? He wouldn't have a problem talking out of the side of his mouth saying, well, Rickey takes 25%. I mean, and he wasn't alone in terms of, first off, in terms of his assessment of Rickey, in those years with those Cardinals and so on, and even with the Dodgers, if you look at some of those, that's very, right. That's one of those things that's sort of wrote in the history books about Rickey. So he's well known, but yeah, I do think Rickey also was smart enough to know, okay, like when Mize was 28 the year that last year with the Cardinals, and he had hurt himself a couple of times, and he was looked at, and that made him appear as not a team player, right? So, and again, I'm not going to say he was or he wasn't, because I haven't found evidence that he wasn't a team player, right? When I saw that he had played with injuries at different times, and then of course sat out at different times, I think he was just a regular. I don't think he was, he wasn't a saint, but he wasn't just playing for himself. At any rate, I do think it was the irritant that made, and the expense. Somebody at his age, and I also believe that. Look in 41, he plays a complete season with the team. He gets sent to the Giants basically the day after, or a couple of days after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I think a lot of minds were on looking at the ages of players, where they might be in a few years, how they might be in terms of physical abilities. And I think Rickey was no different. Certainly we know the draft had been instituted long before, had been instituted like in 40, 41. Roosevelt was, the writing was on the wall. And so I think this would be an interesting, I guess, study. But then for a guy like Mize, I believe it made it a little bit easier for Rickey and the Cardinals to pull the trigger and sort of like, we've got enough coming up. Because look, when they got rid of Mize, look at how good they got afterwards. And it's not like he was hurting the club. If you look at the team's record with Mize in the lineup, they did well. They did great, and he contributed. But look at they built a hell of a team. They had Musial coming up. They had, Enos Slaughter, who was coming into his own by the time Mize left. Terry Moore. They had a pitching staff for the ages, or at least for the next 4, 5, 6 years before they burned out. And so, I mean, they really had a hell of a team, built a lot on defense. And what's interesting, and I looked this up just to see if, okay, did they really do better without Mize? They did as a team, but they didn't at first base. When you look at who they replaced him with, they didn't have Mize's fielding records, all, throughout. They just weren't in his class as a defender, and they weren't anywhere near his zip code as a hitter. So somehow or another, the Cardinals were so powerful they could get by with having adequate first base play and superb play everywhere else.
Yeah, look, and Rickey's a shrewd guy, right? So it's not like he doesn't not know what he's sort of doing. Right. So I got a couple of questions around this, right, around this period of time. So number one, you mentioned in the book, and there's some other research I've done, the Giants essentially in New York, right, are eager to get Mize, especially given the fact that it looked like at the time that their first baseman at the time, Babe Young, was going to have to go into military service. Now, I guess the question in there is, to your knowledge, what was sort of the dynamic of the players and their qualifications, so to speak, for military service? Was it a pure play draft and kind of things, scenarios? Because, if they were, again, this is in hindsight, right? But if the Giants were sort of looking to replace a guy who was going to get likely to go into military service, it's just interesting and ironic, or maybe they didn't know ahead of time that Mize himself would wind up going the year after they brought him into the club. Now, I don't know the dynamics of that. I don't know if Mize volunteered or where he got drafted or what, but
he initially wasn't eligible for the draft because he was considered, I think it was and I should have my book open.
Too old, or the bone spurs, maybe
not too old, but a sole source of income for the older women in his life, right? For his grandmother and his aunt.
So there was no medical thing with the bone spurs.
That was brought up by it's funny you say that. It wasn't brought up by the military. It was brought up by people who were trying to keep like Mel Ott, and this kind of thing, people who wanted Mize not to go into the military. But Mize's excuse, if you will, but the law was at the time that he was ineligible at first, but since they, I think they were taking in fathers by that point. By when did Mize go in? Early 43. So, he basically had a choice. He knew he was going to go, so he had a choice. He chose the Navy. He was like, I'm going to join the Navy instead of being drafted. He realized that his number was coming up. So I think this, again, this is something that's worth a book by itself, Tim. This era and how teams, suited up for it, if you will. I think that the Cardinals, they were like, let's unload him. He's 28. Maybe he's an old 28. The same way that the Reds got it wrong about Frank Robinson being an old 30 or whatever the hell it was. But the Cardinals, to their credit, they got rid of Mize and then after that 1 year, he's gone for 3 years. So he was gone from everybody's problem in the National League for 3 years, right? I think that's something that really impacted his ultimately his Hall of Fame, credentials or whatever you might call it later on. I think that's one reason why it took him so long to get in, is he lost a few of those compiling numbers, I guess you'd say.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. The question I had, though, as he's pivoting into the Giants roster is this very interesting asterisk that most baseball card aficionados might either be aware of or perhaps should know as their their passion for this for their hobby sort of it almost has this is an essential component of this. He apparently was part of this lawsuit against a company that was sort of in the baseball card production space, and I guess he wasn't getting either royalties or his rights weren't granted and that kind of stuff. It almost seems like he's almost like I want to say a unionizer, but a guy who was almost standing up for the players' rights and stuff in this baseball card business where I guess he wasn't getting money out of it. I wonder if that maybe was also a quote unquote irritant or a source of issue, say with management, who perhaps was not necessarily enamored with a player kind of.
I think it definitely was. And I will say that this is people buy my book, but I will say one of the things that I was most disappointed in is I didn't include that in the book. It wasn't because I chose not to. As I was doing my research, I just skimmed right past it. It was like, that's a huge, but since writing the book, it is something that's come up and I've talked about it in podcasts and whatnot, but that's a huge irritant. I think that was and again, that, I would not be fair to say that was the icing on the cake, but it was definitely one of the things. He was definitely, it was over money first and foremost. He wanted he did want some freedom. You guys are using my likeness. I was, since reading about it and learning about it, my estimation of him as this what independent kind of person sort of has grown. I feel like that is a big part of why he was sometimes tabbed as a clubhouse lawyer type of guy, and certainly didn't make him a lot of friends.
There's a really good book that came out about 10 years ago by a guy named Dave Jameson that I remember called I think it's called Mint Condition. That kind of gets into that his story a little bit, and I'm sure it's been embellished even since. And I'm not a card guy, but you can imagine. I mean, it's really interesting to know because it's also probably gives you a bit of an insight into his personality and whatnot. I mean, this is a guy who clearly recognizes that he's got some skills, some talent, and perhaps in this case. He wasn't sort of getting fully compensated for it and stuff, and maybe almost unwittingly becomes sort of a player's player, so to speak, and stepping up and speaking out for these guys. But interesting, very early days when versus the industry that is now.
If I am allowed, dude, and I haven't asked, but if I'm allowed, I want to add a chapter or an extra inning to the book that talks about his role in that very thing. I feel like he was ahead of his time and unappreciated even by players because most players weren't thinking along those lines in those days. I don't think. I mean, and I'm talking anecdotally here, okay? I haven't researched this.
Well, this is certainly before free agency, right?
This is decades before free agency, when most of the players, when you read the oral histories, most of them took the attitude that you signed for what they offered. You might hold out for a few, and that's what it was. Rarely did you read about somebody taking a stand, I guess, in as many different venues as Mize did, right? I mean, we're talking about baseball cards here. He did I think he was mercenary to a point. I wouldn't say he was just mercenary, but he knew his value. I think he was very aware of who he was, what he did. He was proud of what he did, but I don't think it was like, I don't give a damn if you recognize it with headlines, but you better pay me, this kind of thing. As he got older, but we're not there yet, and I don't know how you edit this, but as he got older, all of that changed. Like, in other words, like the human condition hit Mize like it did everything else. He was more concerned with legacy and with how he's remembered. When he was younger, it wasn't so much about, the numbers were strictly proof that he was valuable to the team. He realized early on that it was not just fun. I think he had fun. I think it beat work for a living, but he always came across to me as one of the early indications of that corporate type of mentality, which became known as corporate, right? Which is sort of ironic because the corporation in some ways is a plantation, but later on it became to sort of describe something else, a different kind of attitude, business-like. And I think that's Mize. I think he was a little bit ahead of his time. I really do. I would like to something if given the opportunity, I would go back and explore more and write more about that because it's just another layer of who he was.
All right, our friends at the University of Nebraska Press, you're on the spot here. We're already itching to get you a paperback version with an extra chapter or two. So there you go.
Love it.
Okay. So all right. So let's get into a little bit about how he gets into the military. His time in the military. It's obviously with the Giants after a season. How does that happen? And explain this to the layperson because I find this really intriguing. He's also not denied the opportunity to play baseball. As a matter of fact, with the Great Lakes Naval Station, which is just a stone's throw from where we're recording this episode here in Lake Forest, Illinois, it's intriguing to me to know that he gets the opportunity to play as well as serve his country for a couple of years. How does that all happen, and how common is this sort of process of leaving teams and stuff? Obviously, we know what happened with the women's league and all that kind of stuff. There was a depletion of a lot of great players. I'm assuming he went willingly. Was it a sort of a rallying around the flag, that kind of thing? What was his sort of segue into the service? And I'm assuming the Giants keep his rights if he ever decides to come back.
Right. Yeah, all right, Lake Forest. I built houses there many, many years ago as part of a grunt and a crew. So it's interesting. I think one of the reasons he quickly realized that I'd better join the Navy instead of seeing what happens in the Army is because the manager at Great Lakes at the time was Mickey Cochran, the legendary catcher from earlier times, from the 20s and 30s with the Philadelphia Athletics and then the Detroit Tigers. And he was now like 40, 42, and he was managing the Great Lakes baseball team. And the year before Mize got there, they were terrific, right? And I think it was probably a function of somebody higher up than Mickey Cochran, some admiral, like, I'd like to have a great team, and Mize is going to be available. And I'm not sure of what all the machinations were that what the paperwork was that led him to Great Lakes, but I think it was pretty apparent early on that that's where he'd be heading for training and specifically to play baseball. And what happened I think you asked this, but what happened for people who may not be aware of this, is a lot of ball players spent the war years being ball players. I mean, that's what they did. It was it was kind of like, for the troops, you were providing entertainment because most of the fans, like at these games at Great Lakes, were sailors in training. There were thousands of sailors who came through Great Lakes. And so most of the people who attended these games were servicemen and women. And so that was a big, it was one of the, I guess one of the more positive things you could say about being in the military, right, is seeing these games. And so that was definitely part of a plan, I think, for Mize and many others. We can get this guy in. Now, some others didn't have it so lucky, and some others, like Bob Feller, for example, wanted to be in combat. And to what degree, like even Bob Feller, I think, played some baseball. Even Ted Williams, who became a flight training instructor, kind of guy, in World War II, even he played a little baseball. So there were people who wanted to serve in a combat sort of role who did that, right? But then there were probably just as many, probably not as many, I should say, who were able to, hey, if I can play ball and serve as a physical, training instructor, during the week, I'd just as soon do that, and a lot of them did that. You had Johnny Mize, Phil Rizzuto, Pee Wee Reese. The list goes on of Joe DiMaggio, Dom DiMaggio, of just major league stars and also rans who filled these ball clubs, filled Great Lakes. And then as these guys were sent off to other appointments and other bases, right? And so that was the beginning of his journey, was Great Lakes. And it carried on from there for most of the war. He would essentially play organized baseball for the Navy and help Uncle Sam with his bat instead of his rifle.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, you think it's a sort of I don't know, a sideshow given the fact that we're fighting a world war, but there's also the morale thing, and there's a whole. I mean, we've kind of scratched a little bit of this in some other conversations, but just the fact that the amazing amount of talent playing, essentially all-star games, if you will, because there are some different teams and leagues and all
Right.
that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah.
You know, that was part of the morale building for some servicemen to see these great players and stuff.
I mean, in
It was like being
19
in the band, so to speak.
it really was for the servicemen. It was like I'm getting to see like Johnny Mize hit against Schoolboy Rowe or something in this, two stars facing each other with Dom DiMaggio in center making the winning catch. I mean, in 1944, this is weird, okay? So around the same time that the World Series was happening in the US between the St. Louis Cardinals and the St. Louis Browns, you had the Army and Navy playing a service World Series in Hawaii. And a lot of the papers were talking about how, wow, the best baseball is being played in Hawaii right now, not in St. Louis. And, there was a good argument for that because you looked at who was on these rosters, and it was a lot of those guys I mentioned. And, what's also interesting too, a little known, I think, is that in the service, you didn't have it a lot, but you had some integrated baseball. I think there was actually, I would be lying if I said there was more, but there was at least one African American ball player playing in that Service World Series. And I think he was with the Army. But at any rate, so there were some teams around the U.S., in Hawaii, in the U.S. itself, in Washington state, you might be aware of this, that had integrated baseball, right? So it was just sort of an interesting dynamic. It was a top level baseball being played on Army bases. And so these guys who were, working on ships and doing all kinds of grunt labor, fortunately were able to see a couple of great ball games each week.
What kind of action did he see?
You know what? It's interesting. Most of the action he saw that was related directly to military operations, I would say, besides the rare, working as a physical trainer or a boatswain's mate or something like this, it was really on Tinian, his last year of the war. He was sent from Hawaii to Tinian, one of the islands, in the Pacific, actually maybe the closest to Japan. And a number of the ball players, basically, they broke up some of the ball teams from 44, reassigned them, split them up, and sent them to some of the Marshall Islands and some of the other islands in the Pacific as the war was nearing its end. And it was in many ways to serve in the same capacity, morale, but also to actually work, do some physical training with the soldiers, leading them in calisthenics, doing helping to build facilities and manage facilities. It wasn't what I would call frontline work. He wasn't fit. The closest Johnny Mize got to say, quote unquote, combat would have been on Tinian, where there were still dozens, if not hundreds, of enemy Japanese soldiers holding up in hiding places across the island. And of course, it's also where Mize probably watched was it the Enola Gay take off with the atomic bomb for Japan, right? This is where the atomic bomb attacks took off from, was Tinian. It was an airfield, an Army airfield. And so Mize was part of this culture for about, 4 to 6 months, because he eventually got out of the service in time to get to the 1945 World Series. So he was probably stationed on Tinian from like March to through September, something like that.
So tell me how he gets back into the big leagues. I'm assuming the Giants got to keep his rights because that's who he was with before he left, right?
Oh yeah,
Um,
ironclad.
and give us a sense of how he, by all accounts, yours included. Is it fair to say he kind of picked up where he left off and arguably, I
He
mean, in some
did.
respects, he had some of his best numbers coming right back out of the gate.
He did. It's really interesting. I was thinking about this today ahead of our talk, like because honestly, Tim, if it hasn't shown already, I don't get to do podcasts every day, but and talk about this stuff. So I'm trying to remember without looking at going to Baseball Reference. I didn't have time to do, but how many years that he had that were actually like really Hall of Fame level. And so he picks up right after, like right where he took off, right? He had finished his first 7 years, I guess it was, with these phenomenal numbers, right? Top of the class. Every year he led in something. And then he kind of takes up where he left off. The next 3 years, he has ridiculous. So he essentially has 10 solid, I mean, Hall of Fame level years, 11 if you add, later on, we won't get into, but he had 1 year with the Yankees that was astronomical. But all that to say, he does. He kind of hits the ground running, highly anticipated as it is for everyone. I mean, it's the biggest spring training anyone has seen in 1946 because you've got all these ball players coming back. Mize's manager Mel Ott with the Giants is fetching because what am I going to do with all these guys? He's got to figure out what to do with 70, 80 players in camp, and so, but it's with great excitement, right? It's great positivity, and they're excited about Mize and some of his teammates, but of course, especially the perennial All-Star Big John, and he has an incredible year. I mean, he hits 337. His on base is 437. It's like I think that might be his highest, second highest of his career. He has ridiculous numbers. That would have put him among the leaders, except he's injured. He injures himself with two hustling injuries limit him to about to 100 games that year, 101 games that year. And so consequently, he doesn't really get to qualify for some things he might have led in, like slugging and, on base, batting, this kind of thing. But he has these incredible numbers. He finishes one home run shy of the home run lead, even though he has only 377 at bats. And Ralph Kiner, a young kid, a rookie, who you've heard a little bit about, wins the home run championship by one with 23, the lowest total in like 20 something years, I think, at the time, probably in 20 years. And but nonetheless, Mize is a force already, and yes, he comes back strong. He is hurt, and I do think those injuries play a role, in his longevity ultimately, as you might think they would. He's only 33 when he comes back, but still, 33 is getting up there for an athlete. So yeah, he hits the ground running,
And he and
and
Kiner were kind of they're sort of the original, like they were battling it out for a bunch of years for home runs and that kind of stuff and batting titles, right? Those
for
couple
three,
of years.
yeah, for 3 straight years, they were neck and neck. Kiner never felt great about his home run championship as a rookie because he knew Mize was, and they became friends later on. So I think they probably talked about it. But he knew that Mize only played like 2/3 of a season, and if that, not even that much, and so he always felt, yeah, he says he would have caught me and beat me if he had been healthy. But the next 2 years, they tied for the home run lead, 47 and 48. It was really historic kind of home run battles, kind of interesting, sort of tense stuff at a time when, I think a lot of media attention a lot of newspaper attention was played on that kind of thing.
All right, so tell us how then he goes from the National League Giants to the frankly probably the hated or at least the New York Yankees. And I also want to sort of couch this into, this is obviously the sort of last third, I guess, of his career. It would seem that in 1949, you mentioned it before, he's getting up there in age, and while he's still, a huge contributor, it's obvious that his playing time is not where he likes it to be. This was no how can I slide into retirement, so to speak. I think this is just this almost to me is like an exclamation point of the
Yeah,
final part of his career going to the Yankees.
I think so. I think he thought.
Maybe unexpected too. I don't know.
I think unexpected, probably by him. You know, he always thought he'd stick with the Giants, and also yes, an exclamation point in his estimation because he always thought of that as, you know, again it was a weird time, but to slide into that transition, you know, first he has this ridiculous season that will never be repeated as a 34, his last. I mean, superior. I mean, he has 34 and 35 years of age. He has two great seasons, but when he's 34, he hits the 51 homers and only strikes out 42 times. He hits over 300. I mean, it's just a ridiculous year and almost breaks, or at least for a while, he's ahead of his cousin-in-law Babe Ruth's home run pace, and the Babe is even rooting for Johnny. You know, the Babe lives in New York. He goes to Giants games. He's rooting for his young cousin-in-law, and so but very. It's interesting. He goes from 51. He hits 40 homers the next year. A great year. Once again ties for the home run lead. But you can see he's losing a little bit in terms of his batting. He's going a little more for homers, even though he's not hitting quite as many. He's older, not quite as strong. His shoulder's been hurt already by now, but he's getting those home runs to right field. He's hitting a little bit more to that friendly, you know, Polo Grounds right field. And by 1949, as you mentioned, he hasn't quite disappeared. He's contributing. He's okay numbers, you know, but he's a 260 hitter. You know, he's hitting for the Giants, you know, 18 home runs through 100 games, and DeRocher doesn't want Leo DeRocher, the newish manager, doesn't want this old slow fat guy. You know, he wants to build the team for speed in the future, and so he deals him to the Yankees. And at first, Johnny's kind of, geez, you know, Horace Stoneham, the owner of the Giants, had just told him a month earlier, you know, Johnny. This sounds like the death knell to me. He says, Johnny, you're a Giant for life. We're going to find a place for you in this organization. Johnny's wife wisely told him, she says, watch out, your days are numbered here. And she was right. And of course, a month later, he gets sold to the Yankees. He clears waivers in the National League, which is unusual. But then what happens is essentially at the All-Star game, Casey Stengel is talking with Frank Frisch, who is, I think, the manager of the Pirates at the time and a coach on the All-Stars or something. And he asks Frisch about Mize. And Frisch used to be Mize's teammate and manager. He says, what do you think? Can the old guy, you know, still get around on the fastball, this kind of thing? And Frisch tells Casey, he says, if he becomes available, get him. And that's what happens. And so in late 49, August of 49, he gets dealt to the Yankees. Casey acts like, I don't know what I'm going to do with him. You know, Casey's playing it close to the vest, as he often did. And so he gets Mize to become his leading left-handed pinch hitter off the bench for the next 5 years. And a little bit more too. Mize also has moments where he's a full-time player and really contributes in the regular season and perhaps most famously in the World Series itself.
Well, look, and 5 consecutive World Series titles for the Yankees at that time. A role player at that point, but a significant role player. The last laugh, I guess, maybe. If there's anybody who doubted his prowess in his later years and his ability to contribute, 5 World Series rings in a period of time is a one hell of a way to go out of your professional career.
That's it. It was he always thought he kind of landed in heaven. I mean, I think he always made it a point to make it to the Yankees old timer games. You know, he really enjoyed the being part of that, right? And to hear his kids talk about it, specifically his daughter, he talked most fondly about like those years. He'd talk about getting to know Joe DiMaggio and Mantle and all of these guys. He was just sort of proud of that. And I think as he got older, that was a point of pride to him, even more maybe than, reciting his, say, batting averages as a young man. It was like, I played for 5 straight World Championship Yankees teams, that I was Casey's boy, that kind of thing. Because he becomes sort of Casey's unofficial hitting coach in the dugout. And his last great hurrah is 1952, his penultimate year, and he has a decent year again as a pinch hitter. He's always among the league leaders in pinch hits. He's always one of the top pinch hitters. And that year, he only manages 4 home runs, a career low 4 home runs during the regular season, and that's in 150 plate appearances, right? Not a lot of power and a 260 something average. So he gets to the World Series, and Casey realizes that Johnny could hit this National League pitching, right? He plans to start him in a few games, and he does. And Johnny winds up hitting 3 home runs in to help the Yankees beat the Dodgers, and he winds up winning what at the time was considered the World Series Most Valuable Player Award. I think it was called the Babe Ruth Award. And really, Mize, he produces ridiculous numbers. He hits 400 in the series. He hits the 3 homers. He drives in 6 or 7. And Mickey Mantle has a great series as well, and could arguably they could have been co-leaders. But I think there was a lot of I think a lot of people were shocked that look at the big cat. We got to give him the award. He came up big. He hit 3 home runs after hitting 4 all year. So yeah, that was a hell of a way to go out. And he plays one more year, as a 40-year-old, a lot slower, hits a career low 250. But he still is among the league leaders in pinch hits. He still chases the pinch. I believe he's chasing the a pinch hit record, and he falls a little bit short of, like, I think most pinch hits in a season in the American League, and he falls a little short. And being Johnny Mize, he's a little bit pissed off at Casey about that for years.
Still made the All-Star team, though, his 10th and final time. That's another great exclamation point on the way out,
makes
right?
the All-Star team based on that incredible 52 World Series. Everybody was like, well, the big cat is back, and he was a popular choice. I think a lot of fans and players thought a lot of him, even if sports writers had a hard time getting an interesting quote out of him.
All right, a couple of last questions, and this is really cool. I've learned a lot from all of this. So, and your passion for this subject matter is infectious. So, you mentioned before about sort of his wife's sort of perception about maybe the Giants' relationship being a little shaky or maybe soon to come to an end. I just find it interesting that after his retirement, he basically went back into the Giants organization to do a bunch of different things, from scouting and a hitting coach. He was on the radio for a bit of time and stuff for a good 6 or 7 years or so with the Giants organization.
Yeah, he does. He comes
So there had to
back.
be something there, I guess.
There was. They still liked him. I think he still had an affinity. And let's face it, the Yankees weren't offering him a job. I think the irritant Mize had gotten under the penurious George Weiss's skin. I think so. George Weiss of the Yankees, the Yankees general manager, wasn't in a hurry to bring Mize back, but the Giants were happy to have him as this radio sort of pregame and postgame guy for several seasons. Which is weird because he's this quiet Southern guy, and for the life of me, man, I could not get my hands on any recordings. That was like the golden treasure that I was looking for. I couldn't find any recordings of him, but what happens is they bring on the legendary Boston Celtics announcer Johnny Most. Wasn't legendary at the time, but he becomes Mize's partner on the radio, and they call the show Johnny on the Spot. And they just do, a few minutes before and a few minutes after Giants. I think it was home games strictly, but so yeah, and he stays involved. I think that's helps keep him involved as a part-time hitting coach. And but eventually, he has a bad falling out, in the sense that he's up for a job in the Giants minor league system with one of their top minor league teams, Minneapolis. And he doesn't get the job. In fact, he not only doesn't get the job, but he's considered a front runner. But then when they wind up hiring Bill Rigney, who becomes a sort of a famous manager later, when they hire Bill Rigney, the owner of the team says, we were never interested in Mize for this job to begin with. And by that time, I think he was getting more interested in just staying in Florida and the hell with the New York, scene, unless they needed him. If he was ready to come calling if they needed a hitting instructor, but it just didn't happen. He didn't get a lot a lot of offers, and that's something that his son allowed for the possibility that maybe Johnny's attitude and his history as a bit of a, I liked your word again, as an irritant. Um, I would have said maybe a fly in the ointment, but whatever he was, I think some of that went against him. He was not considered an insider, right? He was one of the boys in the clubhouse, but he wasn't one of the big boys. And I think it went against him. And he focused on growing oranges in Florida and selling liquor in his liquor store.
All right. Well, that leads me to my last really sort of little bouquet of questions, and that revolves around the Hall of Fame and all that kind of stuff, right? So, um, first of all, do you know how was he inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1981? Did he go in as a Giant, as a Cardinal, or I don't
Ah,
have to kind of choose the team that you kind of want to be most
yeah,
promoted with?
he went in emblemless. He doesn't have a Giants, Cardinal, or Yankees.
Was that
Um,
by is that by choice?
I believe that was by choice. Let me see. Actually, that you're saying that, and I'm
Yeah, it's
talking.
interesting
Yeah,
because I
it's a
mean,
blank hat. Wait a minute. Is it a blank hat? Or does he have Yankees? If anything, he would have put Yankees on there because that was his favorite. You know what I mean? He
interesting.
knew his best years were the with the Cardinals, but his favorite years were with the Yankees, and which
And
is
yet he
weird.
went back to the Giants to actually work at Post Baseball for a bunch of years
Yeah,
before
yeah,
he got out of
exactly.
baseball.
Exactly. And I
Very
mean,
interesting.
as a player, really, I'm thinking strictly as a player. And another reason, and I didn't really touch on this, and I don't know if there's a place for it, but one reason he really liked being on the Yankees, Tim, is he was getting kind of lazy at that point. He liked the idea of just dragging his bat up to the plate. He didn't have to play first every day. He was getting fat, slow, hurt. He was hurting more. And so his attitude was like, hell, I don't mind batting. And then by the time he retired, that's one of the things he considered was, I don't know if I feel like dragging my butt up to the plate, 50 for just 50 times a year next year. I think I'm just going to ask for my release, and that's kind of how it went down with his retirement. He was just sort of like, I think not burned out, but just sort of like, yeah, I'm done with it. We won 5 in a row. I'm happy with that. And I don't want to dicker with Weiss for 15,000 or whatever it was going to be. And I think he felt I can leave this and between what I make with the Giants as a part-time announcer and selling oranges and whatever he thought, I think he's prideful, some of that too. And yeah, but I think his favorite years were as a Yankee player. That was a 5 World Series, man. I think that was what it was about for him.
All right. So here's the last question then. So tell me your perception of uh, why for somebody so prodigious, especially behind the plate, for the bulk of his career across 3 teams, a couple of years with the war. I mean, just an amazing story. You would think this guy would be a cinch for the Hall of Fame, but through the bulk of the 60s and the 1970s, where he was a regular fixture on the ballots, he never got more than 50% of the vote, and it took until a Veterans Committee in 1981 to put him in. What's your perception of why he got overlooked or ignored over that period of time, and it took the Veterans Committee to kind of right that wrong, so to speak, in 1981?
Yeah, I think it's several things that kind of conspire against him. One is, some of that attitude that not being part of being a quiet kind of guy. Sort of the same sort of thing that kind of went against Archie Vaughan too. We can talk about that later for a second, whatever. But anyway, I think that was part of it. But just as one of the things that occurs to me is those last 5 seasons with the Yankees and pinstripes. I think part of it was there's a perception, especially among maybe the younger and middle-aged voters of that time, thinking, say, in the 60s and 70s, who remembered Mize in his last years. They're thinking of, oh yeah, he was a role player on some great teams, but he was a pinch hitter. And I'm not sure how many of the voters say remembered him from when he was in his prime, when like those 10, 11 years I mentioned that are really Hall of Fame quality, just in terms of, the statistics, his home runs and batting numbers, that kind of thing. If you look at those, his 10, 11 best years, they're truly, they're ridiculous. And then, you look at the 4.5 years, if you will, that he was with the Yankees, where his compiling numbers aren't big, they take a hit, and I do think that that had something to do with it. Another thing is the fact that he moved around a lot. A lot of times in the old days, players, well, more often, I shouldn't say more often than not, we can safely say players spent their career with one team or, maybe two. Certainly there were guys who moved around a lot. Bobo Newsom is legendary, comes to mind. But, a lot of these great players spend a long period of time with one team, right? But Mize moved around, 6 with the Cardinals, 5 with the Giants, 5. And so he moved around a lot as well. And therefore, if you think about these compendium lists of, say, the greatest Cardinals of all time, well, Mize played 6 years with the Cardinals. His numbers show that in some ways he could be the best first baseman, right? They're pretty dramatic, but you look at guys like Pujols, people who spent longer periods of time as this sort of thing, right? So I think there's that. I think there's a perception that he moved around a lot, and the perception that maybe he wasn't as good a fielder. He might have been called the big cat. Some guy said he was the big cat because of the way he fielded at first. Other people said it was a mocking nickname, that it was sort of to mock his slow movements around the first base bag. Either way, if you looked at his defensive statistics, you saw that they were pretty good. Some years they were great. They were among the best. Some years, not so much. But are they enough to make him wait 28 years? I don't know. He waited 28 years. For some reason, he slipped through the cracks. And this is something I didn't realize, Tim, until actually after I wrote the book, or actually something that I did include. I think I did include this in the book. It's a very small mention, but there were very few players getting through the doors at Cooperstown for a number of years. And a guy like Mize, who wasn't, say, a DiMaggio, right? He just wasn't going to make it, because a lot of times it was personalities. Oh, this guy was gruff to me, or he didn't give me an interview, whatever reason sports writers have. He didn't play for a winner until he was an old man, that kind of thing. So there's a number of things I think that worked against him, kept kind of pushing him through the cracks. And that by the time that he got to the Veterans Committee, the people who knew him and remembered him were like, this guy was the bomb. Why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? I think I have friends who study this stuff even deeper, in terms of the Hall of Fame politics and whatever, and how that maybe Warren Giles, who was a big part of the Hall of Fame for a long time, maybe he had something to do with keeping Mize out, because he was still upset that, Mize held out that one time in 1937 or whatever the hell it was. But I've heard all kinds of different things. Consequently, he waited 28 years. And at first, I don't think it bugged him, but as he got older and he thought more and more about how he would be remembered, it pissed him off.
Well, no question, right, that he's deserving of the honor.
I mean, I think when you look at I think so too. And I mean, thinking I tried to be as obviously, I love the guy because he was an interesting guy and all this, but I was trying to be objective. Look at his numbers and his statistics, compare them. I did a little comparison with Hank Greenberg, because they often get compared. Hank's a little bit older, but they kind of came along around the same time, and some often they're, looking at some of Bill James' work and some of that stuff where they've compared the two. And Mize usually comes out ahead. And I wanted to look at these numbers too. And I'm kind of on the fence. I'm like, well, yeah, Mize and Greenberg, you can't. They're both great. They both belong in the Hall of Fame. I don't care, who got in first. I guess, point to be made in that part of the book was Hank Greenberg 25 years better than Johnny Mize, because he got in 25 years before Mize. And my argument is, no, he wasn't. He was great, and maybe he was even better than Mize, because he certainly helped lead his teams to the World Series. He won a couple of MVPs. He was a great player, no doubting it. One of my personal favorites, But when you look at the two of them, they stack up very evenly, very evenly. And Mize often comes out ahead. in a lot of these metrics. And so that was the point I guess I made in the, but not so much an argument, but a point in that part of the book was that, they're compared a lot and so on. Is Hank Greenberg 25 years better than Johnny Mize? No.
Well, look, I mean, this is essentially the biography of the guy, right? I mean, it's the classic case if you don't see a book out there, and you want to read it, you got to write it, right? And so, I mean, kudos, because I think this is absolutely, I mean, enlightening to me. I mean, I'm a baseball fan, a passing knowledge of some of the key events over the history of the game, but certainly not, Mr. Saber guy here, but a really interesting topic and character, this guy. And this book is illuminating because it tells a lot of different stories, right? Of not only him as a player, but also what was going on in baseball at the time, the drama, I guess, of and the timing of Hall of Fame decisions, and a guy leaving like a lot of players did at that era for 3 years to go, for the war effort. I mean, these are it's not just an individual story. It also sort of it puts it in the tableau of was going on in the game around that time as well. And if you're looking for a deep sort of representative story on some level, this is certainly that, plus an interesting story in and of itself.
I mean, thank you so much, man. I appreciate that. There's a thing we hadn't even mentioned, and I don't know if there'll be time for it or what, but my favorite, this almost became the whole book. And this was honestly, I consider doing a whole book on, and you probably know which chapter I'm thinking of. Chapter 4 is about, it's called Baseball with El Maestro. And it's about the winter that Mize spent, and it's little known, and it's not unknown. And I mean, there have been some great, especially some Latin American journalists and historians who have done some incredible work on this. But I think it's the first time you're going to see this collected in a book, and this much of it. He spends this winter in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic when he's 20 years old, 20 becoming 21. He's a minor leaguer, a triple A minor leaguer, and a friend of his who's an older player with the Brooklyn Dodgers, who was a Southerner like Johnny, lived maybe 100 miles from where Johnny grew up. And he sort of talks him into, hey, you know what? Why waste our time playing in some boring, barnstorming games in upstate New York? We can go to Puerto Rico. It's sun. It's fun. We make extra money on this team that I know of. It's a barnstorming outfit. So he does it. Here's this kid who's lived this mostly, protected North Georgia kind of life. And he's like, yeah, what the hell? And they go down there. He winds up getting recruited by none other than Martin Diego, who even at that time was considered maybe the best player in the world. The guy who's a Negro League superstar in the Hall of Fame also. He got there before Johnny Mize. And he recruits this kid Mize to play for his super team that he's assembled to win a tournament in the Dominican Republic, with the bloodthirsty dictator Rafael Trujillo looking on. I mean, this is a little known story about this quiet sort of, this is a story Mize's kids didn't even know, because he was just like, as an old man, somebody asked him, because, that's when he talked. If somebody asked him, Johnny, who's the best player you ever saw? That'd be this black Cuban man I knew named Martin Diego. And he could play every position. And I thought I was having a pretty good year, hitting about 350, and they were walking him to pitch to me. This is how he remembered it. Now, some of it's wrong, because the box scores I found, most of the time, that's not how the batting order worked. But I wouldn't be surprised. There's probably practice games. But all this to say, the man spent a winter in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico playing with alongside and against some of the best Negro League and Latin American ball players of all time. And it's just sort of lost to history in a sense. I mean, except for the few nerds like myself who were into that and thought that, wow, this would make a whole book by itself.
Remember, they're not booing, they're yelling, Jerry, Jerry. Jerry Grillo, thank you, kind sir, for your conversational contributions to our show this week. The book is a very, very well-written and frankly now only biography. This is probably the authoritative now backgrounder on the great Johnny Mize. It's called Big Cat, The Life of Baseball Hall of Famer Johnny Mize. It is available now wherever good books are found. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. Of course, if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode 379 with Jerry, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to the book. And by doing so, a couple of nickels and dimes of referral of will come our way to help keep our lights on. We appreciate that. And you'll get it as probably as fast as humanly possible. Hardcover, Kindle, even the audio book version, he says. And again, it's called Big Cat. Great book and really interesting story. I learned a ton. And Johnny Mize, arguably very underrated, but a solid member of that Baseball Hall of Fame. You can follow Jerry at these various places. You can go to his website at jerrygrillowriter.com. Jerry is Jerry, Grillo is Grillo, jerrygrillowriter.com. You can see Jerry in person in beautiful Dahlonega. That's it. Dahlonega, Georgia, the Dahlonega Literary Festival coming up on, what day is it? It is on March the 1st at the Dahlonega Baptist Church there. Lots of great writers, and he will be there to discuss the Big Cat book as well as his various other writings, and I'm sure we'll be more than happy to sign a copy of said book. And by the way, if you happen to see him there, why not take a picture with him and send it to us and tell him that, or hopefully tell him that you heard about him and the book on the Good Seats Still Available podcast. We'd love to publicize that, of course. What else? You can follow Jerry. Where else? Lots of different places. On Facebook, he is at jerry.grillo.94. You can follow him on the Blue Sky. That's at 4 Crickets, FOUR crickets.bsky.social. Or just search up his name there on Blue Sky. And on Twitter, you'll find him in 2 places. One, Twitter/X, excuse me. One is at the 4 Crickets. That's THE, the word 4, the 4 Crickets. And you can also follow his X account where he channels his best interpretation of the Big Cat. And you can follow him on that X Twitter thing at Big Cat Mize. Big Cat Mize. While you're online and tooling around, follow us, why don't you, on the various socials. We are probably the most active on X and Blue Sky at this point. On X, you will find us at Good Seats Still, and on the Blue Sky, you will find us at goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us other places too. YouTube, we post all of our shows, etc. And if you haven't subscribed or followed us, yes, on your favorite podcast feeds and all that kind of stuff, what are you waiting for? Just add us in there. It doesn't cost you a thing. Hopefully you'll enjoy tons of other episodes, both past, not only present, but also in the future. And you'll be sure to get all the latest episodes as we send them out to you through the ether. Goodseatsstillavailable.com. You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And there you go. Jerry Payne, Mr. Audio Excellence himself. Thank you, kind sir, for putting up with our illnesses, etc. this last couple of weeks and stuff. And perhaps an episode that was of interest to you this week, given the northeastern Georgia roots of said topic of the Big Cat. And thank you all for listening. We appreciate it. Lots of great stuff coming up for you. And wish you happiness and healthiness as the weeks progress here in 2025. We'll see you soon. Bye.